Hey guys, today on the shop we're going to be talking about the 6.7 liter Ford EGR cooler replacement. Going to be taking care of that P0401 insufficient flow EGR code, and I'll show you a few tips and tricks that I use along the way to help speed up the process. So the 6.7 liter has two cooling systems. They have one for the main radiator, and that's petcock is on the driver's side, and there's one for the secondary radiator on the passenger side, and that does the EGR cooler and also the intercooler. So you're going to have to drain both of these systems to do that. So let's start off with the driver's side. You're going to want to make sure you release the pressure on the cap before you start opening up the petcock, because you open up that petcock and there's pressure in the system, you're going to be in for a little bit of a surprise. So while that's drained, you can go ahead and start taking the air box out and all this intake system out. Over on here is just a few clips to get your air filter lid off, and then there's just an 8mm right here at the intake side. Start taking that off. Get this whole intake system out of your way. So once that's all drained down, you can start taking all these coolant tubes off that go from the bottle to the EGR cooler, and they clip into the intake right here. I just like to use like a trim panel tool to pop off all these clips so you don't break them. And then you can just use a regular pair of pliers, or even a specialty pair of pliers for these kind of hose clamps, and just start popping all these off and get them out of your way. So the next obstacle you're going to have to contend with is this pipe right here, and it goes from into the exhaust manifold down to the over to the EGR cooler right here. And the issue is the bolts usually come out fine right there, but some of the bolts sometimes down where that goes down into the exhaust manifold, those bolts sometimes break off. So what I like to do is I like to get the torch with a little heating tip, like a brazing tip almost, and just get down there and just very, very gently warm up the exhaust manifold side, and try not to heat the bolt too much, but actually heat the manifold itself, and then just apply nice light even pressure onto that bolt, and I've had pretty good luck getting them out that way. If they break off, I mean, you end up having to go in there and drill them, and they can definitely be a little bit of a pain, but unfortunately there's really no other option. You just got to heat it, hope for the best, and then if it does break, then you got to kind of drill it out. So a lot of guys will say to take the upper plenum off. I don't really think that's necessary unless this bolt breaks off. I try to avoid it. A little bit of a pain to take that plenum off. So what I like to do is I grab a little 8mm swivel socket on a 3/8 drive adapter, and then I reach down inside there with that. So this is the kind of heating tip I like to use. Make sure you have plenty of light. Once you get that pipe out of the way, next step is take this one off right here. Goes from the intake plenum over to the EGR cooler. So there is a little probe here that measures exhaust temperature. It's actually technically intake temperature. And that comes up underneath. And you're just going to want to unplug that. And then take your trim tool. Separate the connector from the intake manifold. I like to leave these things threaded in if I can. A lot of times, these sensors aren't so bad, but a lot of EGT probes, if you have any experience with them, you try to loosen these things up and they pull the thread. So if I don't have to take these out, I avoid it at all costs. All right, now we can start pulling this valve off. First thing you want to do is unplug the valve itself. And then there's 10 bolts that hold this EGR valve on all the way around. Start popping all those bolts up. Now, depending on what area you're from, these little dowels on here can be a little bit tricky. I mean, these things got corroded in here, so definitely something you're going to watch out for. You want to make sure that you're not going to be breaking the little ears off of the EGR cooler housing here, or on the EGR valve, especially if you're going to reuse that. After you get that valve out of your way, next thing you're going to want to do is take this little diverter valve piece off. So you're going to take this vacuum line off. There's one connector, pop that off, and then same thing as the EGR valve. There's a bunch of bolts all the way around. There's 2 bolts that hold this little plastic wire loom on. You can just take those bolts out, push the wire loom over to the side, and then take those surrounding bolts off. So as you can see, that cooler is just plugged solid. Alright, let's pop that cooler core out and get this cleaned up. So there's really no way to avoid it. When you pop this cooler core out, it's going to make a mess. I mean, this housing will hold a whole bunch of coolant. Doesn't matter how good you drain the system, it's just going to hold it in there. So just put a big bucket under it and be prepared to clean up after. Don't be afraid to bend this housing a little, in the cooler core a little bit here. Obviously we're replacing this. Just make sure that you're not marring up the housing or ruining the sealing surface at all on the housing itself. But the cooler core, you can bend that, it doesn't matter, that's just going in the trash. So the cooler can't come out with this degas bottle in the way. So go ahead and remove that. There's two 8mm bolts right here, a couple of hoses. Pop those off and get this bottle right out of your way. So a lot of guys don't like to do it this way because there's two O-rings way down inside on the back end that if you take the whole cooler housing out, there's a back cover that you can take off and you can pretty easily get to those O-rings. I personally found it a little bit more difficult to get the whole housing out as compared to just going in with a long pick, getting the old O-ring out, and then just very carefully taking a pair of needle nose pliers, long needle nose pliers, and going in and inserting that new O-ring. It is a little bit tricky the first couple of times you do it. I don't advise this, but I've seen quite a few guys get away with just not even changing those O-rings. I mean, that's totally a call that has to be up to you because the issue is if that O-ring does fail, now you're leaking coolant into your EGR system. So I always advise changing those O-rings, but the easiest way for me has been with a long pick, get the O-ring out, and then take a pair of needle nose pliers and just get that new O-ring in, make sure it's seated in the groove nice and good. Check down inside, make sure they're in. Good to go. Now you're ready to start reassembling. So aside from the cooler, you're going to need this replacement gasket set. It's actually a kit. It comes with pretty much all the gaskets you need to do the job. I'll put a link in the description of the video below with the part numbers, and it'll be the part number for the gasket kit and a part number for the cooler itself. And then I'll also put a link to the orange coolant that you got to put back in these trucks. I also suggest at this time adding the coolant additive. It's one of those regular service interval things for Ford. Typically by the time the EGR cooler is bad, it's also due for the coolant additive. So I'll put a link in the description for that also. So if you really struggle to get those O-rings out of there, don't feel discouraged. They can be difficult to do. I mean, I've done so many of them that it kind of almost comes as second nature to me. And I've had a pretty easy time switching them like that. But just for you guys out there that either don't feel comfortable doing it that way or you struggle, it's not that much harder to take the rest of the cooler core out. There's only 7 more bolts. There's 3 across the front and then 2 more on each side. And then you can take the whole cooler housing right out of the truck. It does get a little tight over on the AC line. Some guys suck down the AC. Some guys will disconnect the PCM and get all that out of there. I don't really feel like that's necessary. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pull this cooler housing out so you can actually see where those O-rings are. You get a better idea of it. And you can also see, if you do prefer to pull the housing out, you can see how that goes. Now, on the other hand, if you do manage to get those O-rings changed out and they're in there nice and good. At this point, you can start reassembling. Make sure this surface is nice and clean here, and then start putting the gaskets on in the order that they came off. Once I get this cooler out, I'll kind of have a little tutorial. I'll show you exactly which way this goes back together, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to assemble this whole cooler housing together off of the truck, and then we'll install it as one unit. So aside from those 7 bolts that hold that cooler on, there's a couple of things I forgot to mention. Like I said, it's been a little while since I've done it this way. Is the exhaust back pressure tube has a nut that holds the tube right onto the back side right here. It's a 10 millimeter nut. If you take this one coolant tube off right here, it makes it a little bit easier to get to. And then there's a little plastic retainer that holds the wiring harness on right here. And then there's 2 little clips that hold the heat shield that goes over the top of the injector lines that you just got to pop those off. Once you get those out, you can just kind of pop the EGR cooler up off of the dowels, and then just kind of work it out. Sometimes you just got to push up a little bit on this AC line. It does come out. It's not easy, but it does come out of there. Have a little bit of patience. You know, sometimes you got to use a little pair of needle nose pliers to pop those clips off and everything, but then once you get it out, we can take it over to the bench and start disassembling this thing, and I'll show you where those O-rings are. Alright, now that we got this housing on the bench here, what you can do is take these 6 13 millimeter bolts off. Just gently pry it off. Obviously being careful not to mess up the sealing surfaces. Now these O-rings I was talking about are right here. So obviously once you have this out, it's much easier to do these O-rings this way. It's definitely personal preference. Like I said, I don't suggest not replacing these O-rings. I have had a couple come in here that had some issues that this O-ring was torn from somebody that didn't replace the O-rings. So just make sure, however you do it, whether in the truck with a long pick or taking the whole cooler assembly out of the truck, just make sure these O-rings get changed. It's very important. Once you get this thing totally stripped down, you get all the old O-rings off and everything, you're going to want to clean up the carbon and all the sealing surfaces. I like to use a little carbon scraper, nice and gentle, and just kind of get the majority of this carbon off. Once I get the majority of that carbon off, then I'll use like a 3M Scotch-Brite pad, like one of the rectangular pads, and just kind of scuff everything up and make sure everything's nice and clean. And then I'll go over everything with a nice spray of brake clean, and make sure that all the sealing surfaces are nice, and you try to get as much carbon out of this thing as possible. After you get it all cleaned up nice, now you can put these new O-rings in. Make sure they're seated all the way into the grooves. And then I like to lubricate these now. I use transmission assembly lube because it doesn't eat away at any of the O-rings, and it works pretty good. Just kind of rub that on the O-rings all nice. Then you can take your gasket out of the gasket kit and the cover, start putting it back together. So once you get the back half assembled, the next step is going to be to reassemble this cooler. If you wish to do it outside the truck, which I mean at this point we're this far, it might as well do it this way. So I'm going to put this gasket on first. on here you're going to see it says cooler side on one side of the gasket. Make sure you really pay attention to the way these go on. I don't know if you really could mess it up, but it's good to know. So then I take the new cooler and take some more of this lube. I'm going to gently slide it on in. This can be real difficult sometimes to get it seated all the way. I've seen people try to suck it in with the bolts. I've seen all different things. People hit it with a hammer, and when you do that, you can bend this flange, and then things don't seal right. So personally, I like to take it and put it on the ground and push it on in. Eventually, you hear it go thud, and it's seated all the way. Now just check, verify, make sure it's seated, make sure all the bolt holes are accessible, then you're good to go. Then you can take your next gasket. This one right here says bypass side. So this side is going to face the bypass valve. I'm going to put that over the dowel. Put that over the dowel. And then this is something you want to inspect. This bypass valve is very common for failure. So just kind of make sure it moves freely. Make sure this valve is nice and flat, because this thing actually with time will start to curve a little bit, and that can cause a failure. So just make sure that this thing's in good shape. Make sure the surfaces are nice and clean, and definitely get all the carbon cleaned out of this thing, and then you can pop this on. And then last but not least, we get the EGR valve gasket and EGR valve. Now, if you're going to be installing a new EGR valve, obviously this is the time to do it. Don't necessarily have to do the valve just because the cooler failed. Don't forget to change out the gaskets that go between the EGR cooler and the valve cover area here. And just kind of make sure you get everything tucked up out of your way. And then you can sneak this thing in. It's a little bit heavier once you get everything assembled, so just take your time, make sure you're not breaking any clips or hooking on any injector lines, but should be good to go. Just nice and easy, work it in, and then just reverse all the steps from there, start hooking everything back up, and that's it. We'll see you in a little bit. Alright guys, so after you get this thing all back together, it's time to start filling up the cooling system. The best way to fill it up is with one of these vacuum fillers. This one's by Snap-on. There's a few other companies that make them. You don't necessarily have to get the Snap-on one. I'm not going to get into how to use this today, because I'm going to make a completely separate video just on this, and we'll show you that you can use it on anything from a little Volkswagen to a Chevy Cruze or a Ford Focus, all the way up to one of these big trucks, and it works really well to make sure you get all the air out of the system. You don't need it. It just makes life a lot easier. If you don't have one, fill the cooling system up nice and slow. Keep constantly checking it. Make sure those thermostats open up, and after you take it for a drive, make sure you check on the coolant level again. And once you get that coolant filled up, everything's good to go. Clear the light. Take it for a long, nice road test. Make sure you have no leaks before you drive this thing, obviously, and check over all your work. But take it for a nice long road test and verify the EGR is functioning properly. Verify you have no other codes, and from there you should be good to go. I hope you guys enjoyed. I didn't really cover putting it back together. I figured, you could just reverse the steps on how you took it apart. If anybody has any questions on reassembly, feel free to either drop a comment below or message me, reach out to me. I'm here to help, guys. So I appreciate everybody watching. If you liked the video, subscribe. Thanks for watching. In the shop.